This is the book's appendix, Transracial Adoption in the United States and Canada in the Second Half of the 20th Century, A Minor History. In 1955, an evangelical family in the rural town of Creswell, Oregon, petitioned U.S. Congress to pass a bill that allowed them to adopt 8 orphan children from South Korea. The transnational adoption industry as we know it began the year after, when that family began to build an infrastructure to facilitate the adoption of South Korean children to other countries. This was achieved, Elena Kim details, by inserting itself in South Korea as a network of child social services, a vertically integrated system of orphanages, baby homes, medical services, and adoption administration at no cost to the South Korean state in order to encourage foreign adoption as social policy. The Holt Adoption Program Incorporated, founded in 1956, remains at the forefront of the industry it initiated. Today, it is known as Holt International Children's Services. Under Korean law, citizenship passed from father to child. As illegitimate children without Korean fathers, GI babies were stateless persons. At first, South Korea to U.S. adoption primarily involved mixed-race children fathered by American soldiers during the Korean-American War. But by the early 1960s, almost no children adopted out of Korea had been conceived during the war. As Kim Park-Nelson points out, less than 4% of the Korean-American adoptee population was adopted before 1962. But the North American imagination nonetheless regarded the practice through a lens of humanitarian child rescue that, Karen Dubinsky notes, might just as readily be read as kidnapping. Would-be parents have increasingly sought abroad for youngsters when healthy Caucasian infants became largely unavailable at home. A dwindling supply of adoptable mixed-race children had, by the 1960s, led to practices such as baby hunting and financial remuneration to Korean mothers who were counseled by adoption agency workers to relinquish their children. The transracial adoption of Korean children by mostly white North American families, which by the late 1960s grew to include families in Canada, arose from a scarcity of adoptable white children caused by the domestic rises of birth control in the US and Canada and the diminishing number of Eastern European adoptees that had been available in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Simultaneous to the first decade of Korean adoption, a shift in Canadian federal policy on the administration of Indigenous and Métis families that empowered provincial oversight enabled social service agencies to apprehend Indigenous and Métis children and place them in foster care, and eventually with adoptive, usually white families, as is detailed in Jessa Chupik Hall's thesis, "Good Families Do Not Just Happen." Today, we consider this a genocide. In Canada, it is known as the 60s scoop. We are working in the dark. There is nothing illegal or black market about our American adoption program. We are very proud of the exceptionally fine homes we have been able to provide for our children in the United States. We work very closely with the American state-approved adoption agencies, securing in every instance their help and cooperation in doing a home study and following normal adoption procedures. Organizations such as Manitoba's Adopt Indian Métis, or AIM, and the Cross-Border Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, or ARENA, filled the same gap for white adoptive families in North America that Holt and its international colleagues did. Karen Balcom's The Traffic in Babies, Cross-Border Adoption and Baby Selling Between the United States and Canada, is incredibly upsetting in its account of the collusion of governmental and non-governmental agencies to exploit the U.S.-Canada border to evade jurisdictional oversight. But what is perhaps most instructive here is that these maneuvers were in large part also written into social welfare policy and law, just as the Korean adoption industry was written into U.S. immigration law. Ironically, it was criticism from African American and Native American communities that pushed the adoption industry to pursue sources of children outside the United States. In the 1970s and 80s, the number of transnational adoptions from Korea began to rise as American domestic transracial adoption declined. In a sense, the rapid growth of the Korean adoption industry in the 1970s was caused by organized political action by U.S. minority groups against the state abduction of their children in the guise of social services. Almost immediately as Manitoba implemented AIM in 1967, another group using that acronym, the American Indian Movement, for which adoption was a key issue in the struggle for self-determination, was founded in Minneapolis, just on the other side of the Canada-U.S. border. Within 5 years, the upper Midwest, where the movement was most active, came to disproportionately dominate Korean adoptee placement. In the 1980s, Minnesota was home to North America's largest concentration of Korean adoptees. Immigration policy, which barred Asians from entry into the United States, was accepted, then overturned, as the symbolic value of the rescued Korean war waif outstripped the value of racist exclusion policies designed to keep America American. The Canadian government preferred orphan adoptions to refugee resettlement schemes because orphans, by definition, were alone, and the resettlement would not create any impetus for significant family reunification initiatives. In both Canada and the US, transnational adoption pierced important holes in Asian exclusion law. However, when Canadian church groups petitioned to sponsor more refugees following Canada's one-time absorption of 100 refugees from Hong Kong in 1962, they were instructed by the federal government to redirect their humanitarian energies toward orphans. Family separation, it seems, was built into Asian exclusion. Likewise, Asian exclusion was built into transnational adoption.